Samuel and I have been childhood friends, until he met Angelica and started sticking by her side. That day, when both Angelica and I fell into the sea, he swam towards her without hesitation. Later, as he stood by my hospital bed, he asked, "But you can swim, right?" I closed my eyes, not telling him that my foot had been caught in a fishing net beneath the water. Chapter 1. Samuel, help me! I felt myself being slowly pulled into the ocean by the waves. Samuel, help! My cries for help were broken as waves kept crashing over my head. I knew how to swim, but something had wrapped around my ankle, dragging me down. Angelica had fallen into the water as well, but there were several people near her, and her spot was obviously much shallower. The only person I could call for help was Samuel. "Samuel, help me!" I shouted desperately as I struggled against the waves. "Samuel!" I tried to yell again, "My leg is," but my voice was drowned out by the water, and when I surfaced again, all I could see was Samuel's back. He abandoned me without hesitation. With the last of my strength, I tried to call out again, but I was quickly sinking. The last thing I saw before slipping into the depths was Samuel carrying Angelica to shore. I should have seen it coming. Samuel had been choosing Angelica over me for a long time. Chapter 2. Samuel and I have known each other for 9 years. Our parents are business partners and very close. We even ended up at the same university, though with different majors. At first, nothing changed between us, until Angelica came into the picture. "Samuel, I can't take this awful professor anymore. I'm thinking about switching to your major," I complained to him, slamming my textbook shut. He glanced at me. "You're too lazy. Are you planning to drag down our entire department?" After so many years, I was used to his sarcastic remarks. That's just the way he was. In the beginning, his words would bother me, but eventually, I realized he didn't really mean it. Once, I broke a vase that my mom had just bought. Samuel stood by with his arms crossed, making snide comments. "Wow, you must have a death wish." Already frustrated, I accidentally cut my hand on the shattered glass. Samuel immediately sat me down on the couch to bandage my hand. Even though his touch was gentle, he couldn't resist making a snarky comment. "Do you ever use your brain for anything?" Sniffling, I pulled my hand away from him. "I don't need your help, okay? Just go home." "Samuel, I never want to see you or hear your voice again." He looked at me silently for a moment, his expression dark. Then, without a word, he stood up. I sat there, sulking, but I couldn't help but peek at him cleaning up the glass. Seeing him do that made me feel a little better. When my mom got home that night, I panicked. She was furious about the vase, but Samuel stepped in and took the blame for me. As a result, he was grounded for days. Chapter 3. So, after hearing his words, I just gave a soft hum. "Well, if you don't want to go, then don't. What's so great about your major anyway?" I had said the same thing in the past, and he would usually just let out a snort without responding. But today, he surprisingly put down his pen and frowned at me. Have you ever thought that when you're belittling a major, someone out there is studying day and night for a scholarship? Don't you realize that your thoughtless words are also demeaning her? I was taken aback and instinctively asked, "Who?" "Angelica." That was the first time I heard that name from his mouth. After that, Angelica frequently appeared between Samuel and me. In his words, Angelica was resilient and virtuous. Although she had rich suitors, she remained diligent in pursuing scholarships. A clear-headed girl who worked hard to support herself. That noon after class, "Samuel, let's go to that hot pot place on East Street today." I waited excitedly for him outside his classroom as he finished his lecture. Samuel refused outright. "You go by yourself." "I'm going with Angie." After knowing him for so many years, he had always called me by my full name, Violet. I slowly stifled my smile, hesitated, but still said, "We can all go together. We all need to eat, right? She can't handle spicy food, so it's better not." Suddenly, something felt different. Samuel had never cared this much about anyone else before. "Let's all go together." Angelica appeared out of nowhere, breaking the awkward tension. I was about to nod, but Samuel quickly grabbed her by the wrist. Why push yourself? I could tell that even though his tone was stern, it was filled with concern. Angelica smiled softly and patted his hand, reassuring him. I can handle a little spice. Samuel, don't worry. Samuel's frown eased as he looked at me. All right, let's go. I nodded dumbly. Okay. In that moment, I felt like they were the ones who had known each other forever, and I was the outsider. Chapter 4. Sitting at the hot pot restaurant. We usually only ordered the spicy broth, but today, Samuel ordered a split pot for her. I sat quietly on the side, watching the two of them interact across from me. Angelica was eager to try some of the spicy food, but just as she reached out with her chopsticks, Samuel stopped her. He then scooped a meatball from the mild broth to comfort her. As she looked a bit disappointed, I stared down at the now cold food in front of me, suddenly losing my appetite. Cough, cough. I looked up at the sound. Samuel was pouring her water, his voice steady but scolding. I told you, you can't eat this. Why try? I saw Angelica's face turn red from choking and instinctively grabbed the water pitcher to refill her cup. Just as I was handing it to her, Samuel raised his hand to stop me. Forget it. Huh? I stared at him, confused. Samuel grabbed Angelica's bag and helped her up, glancing at me briefly. Didn't I say she couldn't eat this? I didn't understand why he was blaming me. Where are you going? I asked, seeing Samuel already holding Angelica's bag. I'm taking her somewhere else. You finish your meal. Samuel's cold words hung in the air as he led Angelica out the door. The hot pot continued bubbling away, and I found myself staring at the empty seat across from me. Would you like me to add more water to your broth? The waiter asked. Pulling me from my thoughts, I forced a painful smile and replied, yes, please. Thank you. Steam from the bubbling soup rose into the air, making my eyes sting a little. That day, I dropped everything I had ordered into the spicy broth, and I ate until I couldn't stomach another bite. In the middle of it all, Samuel sent me a WeChat message. Sorry, I didn't mean to take it out on you. I stared at it for a few seconds before turning off my phone without responding. Chapter 5. As I approached the dorm building, I could see Samuel waiting downstairs from afar. I pressed my lips together but still walked over. What's up? I asked. He didn't look too happy. Why didn't you reply to my messages? I let out a small ah, not expecting him to ask. I smiled. I forgot. Sorry about that. He stared at me thoughtfully for a while before asking, what's going on with you? Nothing, I replied, using the same tone as usual. Samuel sighed. Don't hold on to this. I'll take you out for lunch again tomorrow. As he spoke, he reached out to ruffle my hair. I subtly dodged and laughed awkwardly. No need. I ate too much today. I'm not really in the mood for hot pot these days. His hand froze midair. Then we'll eat something else tomorrow. I kicked a small stone by my feet and looked at him apologetically. But I'm hanging out with my roommates tomorrow. What do you mean? Samuel looked up at me, his expression hard to read. He smirked sarcastically and said slowly, it's like I'm begging you to eat with me. Huh? Such a small thing, and you're still mad about it. He paused before continuing. I'll ask you one last time. Tomorrow I'm with my roommates. I cut him off and answered directly. Angelica's arrival hadn't only changed Samuel's attitude toward me, it also made me realize many things. I no longer felt the same way about him. Samuel let out a bitter laugh. Suit yourself. That was our first disagreement. Chapter 6. Samuel and I remained in a cold war for a long time. There were only a few teaching buildings, and since freshmen had many classes, I kept running into him in various places, and most of the time, Angelica was with him. They went to classes together, had lunch together, and even strolled around the track in the evenings, things that had never happened when we were together. Yes, I was a bit jealous. I don't even remember when I first started liking Samuel. Maybe it was his sharp tongue, always annoyed, but somehow, he was there to help me solve my problems, giving me a preference that no one else got. But it seemed like I wasn't the only exception anymore. This love, unspoken as it was likely doomed from the start. Once it happened, it wouldn't stop. I never thought Samuel would one day stand on Angelica's side, opposing me, accusing me without understanding the situation. My roommates and I signed up for a conference-themed experience sharing for extra credits. It started at 7 a.m., a rather unpopular time, so there weren't many participants, less than 100. My roommate was still in bed, so I went out to grab breakfast first. She only rushed in when the conference had already started. Several student representatives took turns giving speeches, sharing their experiences. I spotted Samuel in the audience and froze for a moment. It was the kind of event he normally wouldn't attend. But the person on stage soon answered my unspoken question. Angelica was the first to speak. My roommate was hunched over, nibbling on her bread, as Angelica calmly continued her gentle speech on stage. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the podium. I flinched in my seat and looked up. "You made it to college, but you can't learn to respect others?" Angelica said coldly, her gaze fixed on us. In an instant, all eyes turned toward us. Instinctively, I looked at Samuel, but he only looked at me as if I were a stranger. Confused, I turned to Angelica and tentatively asked, "What? Eating while someone else is speaking, is that your idea of respect?" I turned to look at my roommate. She froze, the bread half chewed in her mouth, unsure whether to continue or spit it out. She quickly chewed and swallowed, her face turning red as she mumbled an apology. "Sorry, I didn't have time for breakfast." Angelica sneered. "Couldn't you wake up earlier or wait until after the event to eat?" I frowned, finding her response overly aggressive. I stood up, meeting her gaze. My roommate has low blood sugar. If she doesn't eat breakfast, she'll feel sick. Angelica curled her lips. Then why not eat earlier? It just shows how little you care about this event. Or maybe you just have no concept of respect for others. I was momentarily speechless. Samuel spoke up at the perfect moment. He stood next to Angelica, on her side, opposing me. His voice was devoid of emotion. "She's clearly in the wrong. What are you being so dramatic about?" I stared at him, my hands clenched under the table. "Isn't it obvious? No one in college is going to coddle your temper," he said. Chapter 7. In the midst of the silent confrontation, a soft sob suddenly broke out. Angelica started crying, and Samuel immediately turned to look. She unexpectedly buried her head on the table in the first row, sobbing quietly. I watched in surprise, not understanding why she was crying. Was it really because someone had a meal? Angelica's sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably. Samuel approached her, gently comforting her with a few words before turning to me with a cold expression. His voice sharp. "Violet, you made a mistake and still act so self-righteous. Is this how you were raised?" I was in total disbelief. I couldn't believe he would say something like that. Several girls nearby went to comfort Angelica, then glanced at me, whispering in agreement, "Yeah, totally inappropriate." My roommate suddenly stood up and shouted at Samuel. "I was the one who ate. Why are you yelling at Violet?" I glanced around, noticing that the crowd's discontent was growing. Before Samuel could respond, I took a deep breath, looking at Angelica's trembling back. "Sorry, it was wrong of us to eat while you were speaking." Then, in an even tone, I added, "But if this is all you can handle emotionally, I wouldn't recommend public speaking for you in the future." After that, I didn't look at anyone and left, pulling my roommate along. Just as we stepped out of the room, a familiar voice called from behind, "Stop!" Samuel had followed us. I wasn't planning to respond, pretending I hadn't heard him and kept walking. He suddenly grabbed my arm and spun me around. "What now?" I glanced at him. Samuel pulled me close, looking down at me from above. "Is this your attitude when apologizing?" I nodded seriously. "Should I kneel in front of her? Would that satisfy you?" Samuel froze, as if he couldn't believe I was mocking him. I seized the moment to pull my arm free. Without another word, I gave him a cold glance and stepped back before walking away. "Violet." I didn't turn around. His voice, unfamiliar, followed me. "When did you become so?" He paused for a moment, searching for the right word. "So vulgar." In his eyes, He wasn't like the average student. He'd received an education others couldn't access, lived a life others couldn't dream of, and Angelica held her dignity above all else, to the point of extremity, which happened to align perfectly with his values. Samuel used to consider me part of his world, but after this confrontation, I was honored to be excluded from it. I blinked, focusing on the road ahead, and left without looking back once. Chapter 8. When I got back to the dorm, I blocked Samuel on everything. The saying people who walk different paths cannot make plans together seemed fitting. As for that faint flutter of feelings I once had, it disappeared the moment he and Angelica united on the same front. One evening, after I had just finished drying my hair and returned to the dorm, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Without thinking, I answered it. Hello? There was no sound on the other end except static. I looked at the screen again, then spoke hesitantly. Hello? Have you had enough? It was Samuel's voice, hoarser than usual, without any emotion. I replied, "You've got the wrong number." I was about to hang up when Samuel urgently called out, "When will you unblock me?" I didn't immediately understand. Unblock what? He seemed to grit his teeth as he said, "From the blacklist." I gave a small, indifferent sigh. Whenever I feel like it. I hung up quickly, blocking that unfamiliar number along with him. Chapter 9. For a long time, I thought Samuel and I would continue to stay in our own lanes, not interfering with each other. That was until I got a phone call from my mom. "Violet, let me ask you something. What's going on between you and Samuel?" Her businesslike tone made me feel like she was Samuel's mother, not mine. "Nothing's going on." "Then why did he ask me to call you about going to the beach?" "The beach?" I was completely confused. She replied indifferently. "Samuel and a group of classmates organized a beach trip, and you're supposed to go with them. Why?" I didn't understand. She gave a brief explanation. "You've known each other for years. What kind of problem can't you two resolve? Besides, your dad has business connections with his family." I listened quietly, instantly understanding the true meaning behind her words. That last sentence was the real point. When I didn't respond for a while, she waited for a few seconds and then simply hung up. For a moment, I didn't know who to blame, Samuel for acting on his own, my mother for being so blunt, or myself for being powerless in the situation. Soon after, I received a text from an unknown number. Saturday, 10 a.m. "I'll be waiting for you downstairs at the dorm." I stared at the screen, curled my lips into a smirk, but didn't reply. I didn't block the number either. On Saturday, when I went downstairs, Samuel was already there waiting. In the past, it was usually me waiting for him, but now, I didn't feel like there was anything to be happy about. "You look like someone forced you to come." I laughed angrily and stopped to look directly at him. "Don't you know exactly why?" He pressed his lips together, his face darkening, but he didn't argue. In the crowd, I immediately spotted Angelica, but I just ignored her and walked past. There were so many people that they had rented a minibus to take us. Chapter 10. I've been prone to motion sickness since I was a kid. Seeing an empty seat in the front, I sat down right away. Samuel and Angelica boarded the bus last, and after glancing at each other, they hesitated before looking in my direction. "What?" I frowned, feeling annoyed. Angelica was the first to speak. "That seat is mine." "Huh?" But when I got here, I didn't see anything marking it. Her calm tone had a slight hint of entitlement. "Everyone knows I get carsick, so they left the seat open for me." Seeing that I had no intention of moving, Samuel stepped forward and spoke gently. I already asked the others to save it for her. He rarely used that tone with me, but this time it was for Angelica. "Samuel." I looked at him calmly. "Do you remember that I also get really bad motion sickness?" He froze for a moment, looking a bit embarrassed. "The front seats are packed. Do you really need this one?" Samuel knew how severe my motion sickness was, yet he still chose to stand up for Angelica. If it had been someone else, I would have given up the seat without a second thought, especially since it had been specifically reserved for them. But now that the person in question was Angelica, my attitude changed. The people around us started to murmur in dissatisfaction. Why should I move? I came early specifically to grab the seat. Exactly. I need to play games. And if I sit in the back, I'll get carsick and pass out. Angelica's situation suddenly became awkward, and her prideful nature kicked in. She crossed her arms, raised her chin, and looked around at everyone before shrugging indifferently. Fine. I just won't go. She turned as if to leave. Samuel quickly strode over and grabbed her. In the end, Samuel made a deal with someone in the front row, and Angelica finally settled into her seat. As Samuel walked to the back of the bus, our eyes met briefly. His gaze was full of blame. I wondered how carsick Angelica really was after all this fuss. As I clutched my bag and dozed off, I noticed she was still reading. Later, when we hit a particularly bumpy stretch of road, I barely managed to avoid throwing up by pinching the bridge of my nose. Meanwhile, Angelica's expression didn't change at all. It was only then that I realized what she really wanted was to demonstrate her special status and the group's favoritism towards her. Chapter 11. As soon as I got out of the car by the seaside and breathed in the fresh air, I suddenly wanted to curse myself for being an idiot. All because of a few words from my mom. I was now suffering from the nauseating torment of motion sickness. On top of that, I had to endure the lovey-dovey exchanges between Samuel and Angelica. Everyone was either excitedly swimming in the sea or busy with a barbecue. I walked to a spot on the beach, far away from them, and sat down. Feeling better? Samuel's voice came from behind. His voice was as calm as always, but for a brief moment, it brought me back to the Samuel of the past. The Samuel who, despite his sharp tongue, was reasonable. Though he would tease me, he'd quietly stand behind me, giving me the confidence to face anything. I didn't make any sarcastic remarks like I had before. The dizziness from the car ride hadn't worn off yet, so I just shook my head, not wanting to speak. Samuel sat down beside me, also gazing at the sea in front of us. Why do you always have to clash with Angelica? I scoffed, stood up, took a few steps back, and looked down at him. Samuel, are you okay? Can you not see clearly? Is it really me who's picking a fight with her? Samuel stood up as well, frowning helplessly. Can't you just let her have her way a little? I stared at him for a while, wondering if a logical person would actually say something like that. Why should I? Angie worked hard to get into this school. She's sensitive. All my anger dissipated in an instant, as I had already accepted the fact that he would always side with Angelica without question. I interrupted him calmly. And what does that have to do with me? I looked at a crab shell half buried in the sand, not wanting to argue any more about Angelica. Samuel, don't lecture me about Angelica anymore. I may dislike her, but I've never tried to make you dislike her too, so don't force me to like her. Do whatever you want with her. Just don't bother me with it. The sea breeze blew sand onto the tops of my feet, tickling them lightly. After a long while, his voice came from behind me. So, are you saying you want to break up with me as friends? I didn't respond, unsure of how he defined breaking up. The term seemed childish, yet surprisingly fitting. Chapter 12. Looking at the shimmering waves, I waded into the sea, avoiding Samuel. I didn't venture too deep, but the waves slowly pushed me farther out without me realizing it. As soon as I noticed and tried to swim back, a sudden wave from the deep sea surged up, pulling me further out. I tried desperately to swim back, but I couldn't move another meter forward. Wave after wave came crashing down, and as I sank below the surface, I realized my left calf was tangled in a fishing net. The other end of the net was caught on the coral at the bottom. I tried to move my leg, but it was no use. Then, I remembered something and looked toward the shore. Luckily, Samuel hadn't gone far. Samuel, help me! He immediately looked up at me. I let out a sigh of relief as I watched him walk toward me. But the next second, Angelica's voice rang out. Samuel, help me! Samuel hesitated for only a second before he unhesitatingly swam toward Angelica. The seawater flooded my mouth and nose, and my consciousness began to fade. As I sank beneath the surface, I knew that the boy who had once taken the fall for breaking the vase was now gone forever. Chapter 13. When I woke up again, I was in a hospital bed. My mom was sitting by my side, and when she saw me wake up, She quickly leaned forward. Vi, are you thirsty? I shook my head slightly, not saying a word. Every breath I took made my lungs itch and hurt, and I desperately wanted to cough. She sat back down. In the quiet air, a soft sob suddenly broke through. It's my fault, she whispered. I stared down at the stripes on the sleeves of my hospital gown without saying anything. To say I didn't blame her would be a lie. She was still busy, and despite feeling guilty about me, she soon left after receiving a call from the company. I was left alone in the room, and the stillness felt as though time itself had stopped. I don't know how much time passed before the door to the room opened again. I turned my head and saw Samuel standing at the door, his expression unreadable, not interested in deciphering his emotions. I quickly turned away. He walked over, looking down at me from above. Then he said something I didn't expect. Aren't you able to swim? I merely fluttered my eyelids, then closed my eyes, choosing not to answer and instead shifted to another topic. My voice was hoarse and rough. Samuel, do you remember the question you asked me at the beach? No sooner had I spoken than I started coughing uncontrollably. Samuel poured me a glass of water, but I raised my hand to refuse it and shook my head. For a moment, it felt like we were back at the hot pot restaurant, only with our roles reversed. He placed the glass on the nightstand and asked, "What? You asked me if I wanted to stop being friends with you." He paused. Then his expression returned to normal. I forgot. Why are you bringing that up? Are you feeling uncomfortable? I'll call the doctor. He turned to leave. Samuel. I called after him. Violet. I'm sorry. Why was everyone apologizing to me today? When he turned around, his eyes were bloodshot. I thought Angie couldn't swim, so I instinctively assumed she was in more danger. Ever since Angelica appeared, I was no longer his instinct. I nodded and suddenly asked, "So do you like her?" If that were the case, it would explain why she was always Samuel's first choice. Childhood friends never seemed to stand a chance against the excitement of someone new. It felt as though the sea had washed away all my resentment. So I asked calmly. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice hoarse. I don't know. I took that as an admission. Whether he liked her or not, it wouldn't change what I was about to say. Here's my answer to your earlier question. I coughed lightly and continued. Yes, Samuel, don't ever come looking for me again. We can no longer call each other friends. Upon hearing this, he stepped forward suddenly. We've known each other for almost 10 years, and you want to end it over something so small? I looked into his eyes, seeing a strange emotion there. Slowly, I spoke. What do you mean by small? I was tangled in a fishing net, unable to move, and I nearly died out there. Is that what you call small? In an instant, his emotions crumbled. He crouched down, bowing his head by my bedside, his voice trembling as he said, I was wrong, Vi. It was the first time he'd apologized, and the first time he'd called me Vi. You must have been terrified. It's all my fault. He reached for my hand, but I gently pushed him away. Yes, it's your fault, and I don't plan on forgiving you. So, can you leave now? He looked up as if about to say something when the door opened again. Haven't you had enough? Chapter 14. Angelica raised her chin. Her gaze lowered as she sneered at me. Hasn't Samuel already said it was unintentional? He even apologized. What more do you want from him? I tilted my head, my fingers tapping unconsciously on the side of the bed. Angelica, who do you think you are, to come here and criticize me? I couldn't help but wonder if my previous tolerance had made her believe she could act so self-righteous in front of anyone. You. Angelica stepped forward, glaring at me. Samuel was right. You really have no manners. Samuel, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke up. Angie, you should leave. You're telling me to leave? I'm standing up for you. Angelica looked utterly betrayed. I picked up my glass of water and took a sip to wet my throat before replying. Just because Samuel treats you a little better, you think you're special, don't you? Angelica's hands clenched at her sides, but it seemed her pride wouldn't allow her to retreat. I spoke slowly and clearly. You need to get a grip on reality. You're just a student who does slightly better than average. winning a corporate-sponsored scholarship, but that's as far as you'll go. Ignoring the rage on her face, I continued calmly. Oh, and by the way, the company that sponsors your scholarship? It's my family's. I'll be sure to advise the parents you think raised their child so poorly, which is to say, my parents, to reconsider their cooperation with the school. Of course, you don't need to worry too much. You can always maintain your little image so Samuel will keep admiring you. Maybe his family can sponsor you next. Violet! She was so angry she didn't care about her image anymore, shouting like a madwoman. Angelica! Samuel stood up, blocking my bed. I told you to leave. Angelica, perhaps really considering the fact that Samuel's family could sponsor scholarships, just stared at me coldly for a long moment before turning and leaving without a word. I'm sorry, Vi. I didn't mean for her to come with me. Stop. I cut him off. Don't call me that. When I used to be so good to him, I called him by his full name. There's no need for such intimacy now. Do you really have to make it this final? His voice was soft. I still remember the waves crashing over me, engulfing me completely, pressing in from every direction. That silent, suffocating feeling is something I'll never forget. I coughed twice and sighed. I'm really tired. I want to rest. This confrontation ended with Samuel leaving. It wasn't just an excuse to get rid of him, I was genuinely exhausted. Not long after, I fell asleep. Chapter 15. The next day, when my mom came to visit me, I suddenly realized I still didn't know how I got back to shore. It was clear I couldn't have washed ashore by myself. The waves were incredibly strong at the time, pulling everything deeper into the ocean. If I had washed ashore, it could only have been because the tide had receded, or the winds had shifted direction. But neither of these things could have happened so quickly, which means someone must have saved me, and I was certain that person wasn't Samuel. I didn't even consider him. Mom, who saved me? I asked. My mom opened the thermos she brought and replied, Samuel carried you back. But from what he said, it sounds like he found you after you had already washed ashore. I nodded, saying nothing more, and began sipping the soup she handed me. After being discharged from the hospital, I quickly returned to school and resumed classes like any normal student. But in reality, the whole incident still weighed heavily on my mind. One day, I ran into a classmate who had been at the beach that day. Feeling better? She smiled as she greeted me. I nodded. Much better now. Thank you. After a pause, I asked, by the way, did you see who pulled me out of the water that day? Of course, she said, her eyes widening. Lots of people saw it. It was Oscar who carried you out. Oscar? I was confused. Yeah, Oscar. He's pretty famous. And he's also your senior. You didn't know? I shook my head awkwardly. Do you have Oscar's WeChat? Could you send it to me? I couldn't let him save me without at least thanking him. Well, a lazy voice came from behind, interrupting her. It's always Oscar, isn't it? Even after 3 years, girls still ask for his WeChat every day. I turned around to see two guys standing behind us. The taller one, wearing a black t-shirt and loose gray sweatpants, chuckled as he glanced at me. Then he jokingly scolded the other guy, his voice deep and magnetic. Get lost. All right, I'll leave you two alone. I don't want to be the third wheel. Without even giving me a chance to speak, he pushed the girl away and left. So, you were looking for me? Suddenly, it was just the two of us. I nodded, my expression serious. Thank you, senior, for saving me that day. He raised an eyebrow slightly. It was nothing. He made it sound like pulling me out of the ocean was no big deal. I pressed my lips together and continued. Do you have time for lunch today? I'd like to treat you as a way of saying thanks. Not really. I've got some things to do today. Oscar's expression remained unchanged. But why don't you add me on WeChat? I'll let you know when I'm free. I didn't sense anything odd about his response. Sure. We exchanged WeChat info. Not sticking to him today? He asked suddenly. What? I didn't catch his meaning. Nothing. He didn't repeat himself. Glancing at his phone, he accepted my friend request and mentioned he had class, then left. Chapter 16. On the way back, I ran into Samuel again. Where did you go? I thought to myself. What does that have to do with you? But I replied more politely, just handling some personal matters. Even his downcast eyes looked filled with melancholy. This afternoon, I went to the hot pot restaurant on East Street. I nodded indifferently, feeling irritated as he blocked my path. Back then, I left you behind and took Angelica with me. You must have felt really sad sitting there alone, right? Thinking about it, that's when things between us started to go wrong. It sounded like an apology, yet he refused to lower his head. If you have something to say, just say it, I replied, growing impatient. Half a minute passed, and he still hadn't spoken. I was about to step around him and leave. Violet. He stepped closer, looking straight into my eyes. I don't like Angelica. I just admire her. That's all. His tone was unusually serious. I got used to having you around and thought you'd never leave. So you took me for granted and thought you could hurt me whenever you wanted. I finished his sentence. He opened his mouth as if to say something. I waved him off. If this is another apology, save it. It doesn't matter anymore. Then what do you want me to do? He asked with a bitter smile. I pushed him back with my bag. Just stay away from me. I sidestepped him and hurried away as if avoiding a virus. As soon as I got back to the dorm, I received a message from Oscar. I'm free on Saturday. I typed back quickly. So am I. Senior, should we go out in the afternoon or at noon? Let's go in the morning. Morning? What would we even eat in the morning? I paused for a moment but replied, okay. Chapter 17. In the 9 years I've known Samuel, I'd never seen him get into a fight. For one, no one was foolish enough to provoke him. And two, word had long spread about his skill in kickboxing since elementary school. Anyone who had the slightest thought of challenging him quickly abandoned it. But Oscar was different. Saturday morning, Oscar sent a message right on time. I'm downstairs. I grabbed my bag and rushed down. He was dressed similarly to the last time we met, except now he wore a black baseball cap. His gaze followed me as I approached, and he gave a slight smile. Why the rush? For some reason, his tone had a hint of affection. I shook my head quickly, trying to dismiss the strange thought. I had assumed we were just going out for lunch, but Oscar ended up taking me around all day. From the shopping district to the department stores. After lunch, I thought we were done, but he drove us to a newly opened trendy bubble tea shop. Want a drink? He rolled down the window, gesturing toward the shop with his chin. I shook my head. I'm too full from lunch. Just as I spoke, the shop's loudspeaker blared, try our new taro mochi bubble tea, only here on East Street. I felt a bit embarrassed as I found myself tempted. Oscar seemed to notice and chuckled. You want one? I glanced at the sign showing the new bubble tea flavor and quietly admitted, yeah, wait here. He nodded and got out of the car to stand in line. I watched his tall figure in the crowd, feeling a momentary sense of confusion. From the very start of our outing, Oscar had paid for everything, food, fun, and now drinks. I hadn't had a single chance to pay, but I was the one who had invited him. By the time Oscar returned, more than 10 minutes had passed. I took the tea. Senior, I could have gotten it myself. He nodded slightly, fastening his seatbelt with one hand on the steering wheel. But there were so many people. I was worried you wouldn't make it through the crowd. Oh, I accepted the explanation. It wasn't until evening that we finally made it back to campus. As we arrived at the dormitory, I was about to say goodbye and head upstairs. Wait a second. He interrupted me. Then he leaned down toward me, tilting his head near my neck. Instinctively, I took a step back. What's wrong? He grabbed my arm and pulled me back slightly. Don't move. I think there's a bug on you. I froze. Bugs being my lifelong enemy, following the motto, if the enemy doesn't move, I don't move. I stood still, letting him handle it. He lifted the bug off me, and just as I was about to relax, a strong gust of wind blew past us. I even felt my bangs lift in the breeze. I stepped back, finally seeing clearly. Samuel, with a dark expression, had thrown a punch at Oscar. But Oscar, without flinching, blocked it with one hand. What were you two just doing? Samuel's rough voice carried a menacing tone. Chapter 18. I furrowed my brow. standing in front of Oscar, and pushed him away. "What's wrong with you?" He acted like he hadn't heard me, grabbing my hand and pulling me toward him, staring at me intensely. He said, "So you're with someone else this quickly? Didn't you like me?" A chill shot up from the soles of my feet to the top of my head, leaving me in a daze. He knew. He had always known. Since when? Before he met Angelica? He knew all along, yet he shamelessly stood by Angelica's side, openly hurting me. I stared at him without blinking, my mind completely blank, until I heard a voice behind me. "Let go." Oscar stepped forward, his face expressionless as he pushed down Samuel's hand. Samuel squinted at him, locking eyes, but didn't loosen his grip. Both of them were clearly using force, their veins bulging on their hands. My wrist felt like it was dislocated from the pressure. "Aw," I gasped softly. Samuel shifted his gaze back to me, immediately letting go. The lack of blood flow made my wrist turn a noticeable shade of red. Oscar released Samuel, too, and immediately lifted my wrist, clicking his tongue. "Does it hurt?" I shook my head. "It's fine." Samuel seemed flustered. "Vi, I didn't mean to." "Samuel," I said coldly, "I'm begging you." My tone carried a hint of annoyance and helplessness despite my effort to stay calm. "Stop bothering me. Whether or not I liked you before, at least now I can tell you, I don't like you, not even a little." Samuel's face turned ashen. His lips trembled slightly. Half a minute later, in a daze, he murmured, "So, you didn't like me?" I couldn't understand why he looked so heartbroken, as if he were the one suffering from an unrequited love, as if I were the one who, feeling confident in being liked, was casually throwing hurtful words. The school's broadcasting system played soft, soothing music in the background. My voice was void of emotion. "Yes, I don't like you," I said. Chapter 19. That day, he never took another step forward, as if the fallen leaves between us had become a boundary. He just stood there, looking at me with a very, very sad expression for a long time before silently walking away. Feeling sad? I shifted my gaze from Samuel's retreating figure to Oscar. Sad about what? For him? His tone carried a hint of emotion I couldn't quite decipher. I realized what he meant and shook my head slightly. I had long since lost all feelings for Samuel, ever since he repeatedly sided with Angelica against me. There was no love, no friendship left. What lingered was a sense of melancholy, not for him, but for myself. I felt sorrow for falling in love with the wrong person for the first time. Oscar lazily hummed in response, his tone returning to its usual calm. "You're still quite clear-headed, kid." I tilted my head slightly, confused, and looked at him. "Huh?" He raised his eyebrows but didn't explain. Glancing at his phone, he said, "It's late. You should head back." I smiled politely. "Then, I'll head back. Senior." He gave a slight nod. "Get some rest. Good night." I wasn't used to saying goodnight to men, so I just smiled and turned to leave. But the next second, I was pulled back. Oscar didn't touch me directly. Instead, he hooked his finger around the chain of my bag. "Is there something else, Senior?" His expression was calm. "You haven't said goodnight to me yet." I smiled awkwardly. "Well then, good night, Senior. Off you go." His voice carried a trace of laughter. His deep, rich voice was unusually soothing, and I felt my face heat up for no reason. Back in the dorm, I rinsed my face with cold water. I thought, maybe it's just because the temperature's risen again today. After washing up, I lay in bed scrolling through social media, and the first post I saw was from Oscar. No caption, just a picture, a pot of vibrant purple flowers. In the comments section, our class advisor had left a comment. He asked, "What kind of flowers are these?" Oscar responded quickly, "My violets." I stared at his reply, blinking, my gaze fixed on the word my. After a moment, I turned off my phone and slid it under my pillow, pulling the blanket up to cover half my face. The movement was swift and seamless. In the quiet night, only the stars glimpsed my sudden confusion. Chapter 20. The next afternoon, after class, I received another WeChat message from Oscar, using the excuse, Since I treated you yesterday, how about you treat me today? He tricked me into going out for dinner. But in the end, when I went to pay, it was the same as before, the bill had already been settled. Back at school, I purposely quickened my pace, leaving Oscar behind. Are you still mad? Oscar's voice lazily called out from behind. I rolled my eyes in frustration, not wanting to respond. The footsteps behind me sped up, until he was walking beside me. Such a temper for such a little girl, he drawled. I still pretended not to hear him. Suddenly, Oscar quickened his pace unexpectedly and stopped right in front of me. I couldn't stop in time and bumped straight into his chest. Above me, I heard a low chuckle. I was a bit annoyed and glared up at Oscar. Just as I was about to say something, a trembling shout interrupted me. Violet! I recognized it as Angelica's voice, but it was filled with an anger so intense it sounded like a scream. When I turned to look, her face was twisted, and her whole body was trembling. The way she looked at us was something I had never seen before. It was far more terrifying than Samuel had ever been, 10 times more. Even, she looked like she wanted to tear us apart, with a resolve to drag us both down with her. It was at that moment I realized just how wrong I had been about so many things. The books she was holding fell to the ground, but she didn't pick them up. Angelica, someone who prized her academic pursuits, was letting her books lie scattered on the floor. Even more shocking than that was the reason behind her sudden, overwhelming change. Oscar. More precisely, she liked Oscar, liked him to the point of obsession, with no boundaries, willing to go to any lengths for him. Before I could react, Angelica had already rushed forward and shoved me with both hands. I stumbled backward, falling to the ground, instinctively catching myself with my hands. Oscar rushed over and helped me up. Unfolding my hand, there were faint traces of blood seeping through the dirt on my palm. Oscar only looked at it for a few seconds before gently lowering my hand. Without any expression, he walked toward Angelica. It was the first time I had seen him truly angry, not yelling, just staring at her with cold, dark eyes that made me shudder. Who are you? His tone was strained, a far cry from his usual demeanor. Tears quickly filled Angelica's eyes. Don't you remember me? I froze, forgetting about the pain in my hand. As she sobbed out her story, I slowly began to understand. According to Angelica, at the beginning of the school year, she had been harassed by a classmate who wouldn't leave her alone. After rejecting him several times, he held a grudge, and one day, while Angelica was walking past the basketball court, he threw a basketball at her with full force. Oscar, who was on another court, intercepted the ball. How can you play so dirty with a girl? From that moment, she had fallen for the senior who hadn't even spoken to her directly. Angelica stepped closer, quickly recounting all the times they had coincidentally met. She could even recall specific dates, but from Oscar's expression, it was obvious he didn't remember. I listened, a bit shaken. All this time, I had assumed there was mutual affection between her and Samuel, but then Samuel had said those strange things to me a few days ago. And now, here was Angelica confessing her feelings for Oscar in front of everyone. Chapter 21. Don't tell me you have no memory of it. She shook her head, staring directly at Oscar, her voice trembling. Oscar was completely calm. No memory at all, not even a little. Angelica seemed to collapse, her pale, delicate hand reaching out to tug on Oscar's sleeve. I've done so much for you. Her voice cut off abruptly, glancing at me before turning her gaze back to Oscar. And you say you don't know? I keenly picked up on the change in her tone. Even what? I stood by, watching the tear-filled girl, someone many admired as a cool and distant goddess. Suddenly, a realization struck me. Angelica might not be as simple as she appeared. It seemed like she had deeper, hidden secrets. From my interactions with Oscar over the past few days, he could be playful at times, but he wasn't disrespectful toward women. Yet, Angelica was the exception. Oscar dodged her outstretched hand and let out a mocking laugh. What don't I know? What does anything you've done have to do with me? Did you do something so incredible that you moved yourself, and now you're morally blackmailing me to respond to something I didn't even know about? Angelica's tears fell uncontrollably. her emotions unraveling to the point where she lost all composure. Oscar's words clearly hit her hard. I overheard passing girls quietly sympathizing with Angelica, their whispers clear to my ears. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I sneered 3 times over. People are often like that. They see one scene, the shallowest part of the story, and quickly judge others, assuming and labeling with ease. Oscar, probably uncomfortable with being the center of attention, didn't say anything more. He turned to me. Let's go. We need to take care of your wound. I flexed my hand, the pain from the injury starting to feel numb. I nodded, ready to leave with him. Violet. Stop. I took a deep breath and turned around, looking at Angelica like one would at a slimy slug. Oscar stepped in front of me, blocking her view. If you have something to say, just say it. Angelica's smooth hair fell messily across her face, tousled by the wind. She let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in her eyes. What's wrong? Afraid I'll push her again? I'm just here to say something. Oscar ignored her manic behavior, remaining still. I raised my hand and patted his shoulder. Senior, it's okay. I want to hear what she has to say. Oscar turned to look at me, and I gave him a reassuring nod. Walking around Oscar, I stood directly in front of Angelica. What do you want to say? She smiled as she stepped closer, leaning in to whisper in my ear, her voice low. This is all because of you. I won't let you have it easy. I wasn't surprised at all. It seemed like I'd been waiting for her to say those words, giving me the perfect reason to strike back. I let out a small laugh. Me neither. I won't let you have it easy either. Chapter 22. Afterward, Oscar took me to the infirmary to treat my wound, and we tacitly agreed not to bring up what had just happened. The infirmary teacher was an energetic old man, experienced but with a somewhat quirky temper. He dabbed at my wound with an alcohol-soaked cotton ball. When he reached a particularly painful spot, I winced, my shoulder instinctively twitching. Could you be a bit gentler? Most girls are a little afraid of pain, Oscar said, his voice a bit rushed. I'm already being gentle. Why don't you do it yourself? All right, I will. You go take a rest, Oscar replied quickly. The teacher shot Oscar a sideways glance, as if he'd seen everything before, full of disdain. Finally, probably realizing that disinfecting a wound didn't require much skill, he let Oscar take over. I'll be gentle. Oscar's voice, smooth like jade, could easily charm any girl. I turned my head away, avoiding looking at him, and gave a soft mem. Oscar's technique seemed to be quite good. Before I knew it, the medicine had been applied, and I didn't feel any pain. The teacher, as if holding back his frustration, waved us away with a frown. Once you're done, get out. The infirmary isn't a place for couples to show off their affection. Wow, this old man is trendy. He knows a lot. Oscar didn't give me a chance to deny it, nodded at the teacher's words, and led me out. When you get back, try not to get it wet. Anne, I really know. OS. This is the 7th time you've told me. I grumbled before realizing what I'd just called him. My face stiffened as I turned to look at him. Perfect. He smiled slightly. Keep calling me that from now on. As he spoke, he lightly ruffled my hair. I could hear my heartbeat getting louder, as if a startled deer were trapped inside my chest. Chapter 23. That night, with the help of my roommates, I successfully finished washing up. As I sat in front of the mirror wiping my face, I unconsciously started thinking about Oscar again. When I snapped out of it and looked at my reflection, I realized I was smiling without even noticing. But the good mood didn't last long. My phone rang. It was that familiar, unmarked number. Considering that Samuel had previously called my mom directly, I hesitated for a moment before answering. I heard you had a little argument with Angelica today. I let out a sarcastic mem. Are you going to defend her again and force me to apologize? There was silence on the other end for a few seconds before he replied. No, I heard you got pushed. Were you hurt? For once, I reacted, genuinely surprised. It felt like just yesterday that Samuel was coldly demanding I apologize to Angelica. Now his attitude had completely changed. But aside from that, I felt no other emotions. I was about to hang up when a thought suddenly crossed my mind. Samuel, what is it, Vi? Ignoring the way he addressed me, I asked, does Angelica have some kind of secret she doesn't want anyone to know? Samuel uncharacteristically fell silent for a long time before denying. No, his denial lacked credibility. The answer I was looking for was already clear in the silence before he spoke. Chapter 24. In the first few days, I was completely clueless. The clue came from a conversation I overheard on my way to the cafeteria at noon. I just don't get it. How come Angelica gets the scholarship, but I don't? Maybe because her grades are better than yours. What a joke! I went to the same high school as her, and her grades were average. She still struggles with difficult questions in class, unable to answer them. Then let's ask her later about her rank last semester. See if she's ahead of you. I froze in place, my mind spinning with an explanation that seemed unlikely, but oddly reasonable. Academic fraud. After some inquiries, I finally got hold of Angelica's grades. The ranking and scores matched. But there was a glaring issue with her grades. She had an extremely high score in one of her major subjects, the highest in the entire grade. Once I saw her test paper, everything became clear, but I found myself hesitating. Should I really expose her with this paper? I remembered seeing her one evening at the school gate. Her grandmother handed her a stack of old, worn-out bills, telling her not to be too frugal and to eat well. Angelica pushed the money back, telling her grandmother to use it for medicine and not to buy cheap ones, saying she had a scholarship. While I was still wavering, Angelica made her move. Can you two explain what's going on here? Two identical theoretical reports were slapped in front of me, and I froze. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing at the door. Angelica was sipping milk through a straw, blinking innocently at me. A while back, my roommate and I had both signed up for a city-level competition, but we were on different teams. Coincidentally, we both held the same role in our respective teams, writing research reports. I never expected her to team up with Angelica to falsely accuse me. What hurt more was that when I opened my document, the editing history was gone, clearly tampered with. I never hid my computer password from my roommates, never imagining she would go this far. Angelica didn't choose to simply delete the document. Instead, she wanted to label me as a plagiarist. Her goal was to publicly humiliate me. I had no defense, only finding the whole situation laughable. The pity I felt for Angelica just a few days ago now seemed utterly ridiculous. Just as the stalemate dragged on, Oscar unexpectedly appeared. Violet didn't cheat. All eyes turned to him. Oscar pulled up a picture on his phone and placed it on the table, a picture of me in profile. I paused, then immediately knew what he was getting at. Zooming in on one corner. That day, I was in the library finishing up the report when Oscar texted me asking where I was. A little later, he came in with a cup of bubble tea and set it in front of me. It was the new flavor we had bought last time. I quietly thanked him as I bit into the straw, feeling a mix of emotions. He must have waited in line for quite some time again. The photo was taken then, and coincidentally, half of my computer screen was captured in the background. The photo's timestamp was earlier than my roommate's submission time. Thus, the dirt thrown at me was cleared away. Still harboring other grievances, I noticed that the dean's office from Angelica's department was just nearby. I thanked Oscar briefly before heading straight toward Angelica. She paled after seeing Oscar's involvement. I grabbed her wrist and began dragging her toward the dean's office. What are you doing? She glared at me, twisting her wrist to free herself. Let go! I held my grip, turning back to her with a smile. Plagiarized reports. Academic fraud. Angelica, is there anything you can't do? She instantly lost all her strength, her face turning white as I dragged her along. She wasn't stupid. She knew I wouldn't expose her unless I had irrefutable evidence. What caught me off guard was that Samuel was involved too. She and her major's professor had struck some kind of deal, allowing her to secure the scholarship slot. Their story was remarkably consistent. The deal involved sharing 1/3 of the scholarship money with the professor. But how could a university professor risk his career for a few $100? After the story broke, rumors spread that this professor had always had a habit of touching female students inappropriately, and Angelica's incentives might not have been limited to just money. I just shook my head when I heard it. I hadn't interacted with that professor, so I refrained from making any judgments. Chapter 25. In sophomore year, Angelica and Samuel grew increasingly close. This time, the corporate scholarship was funded by Samuel's father's company. Samuel gave the professor a sum of money, telling him that the spot was already reserved for Angelica and that all he needed to do was raise her scores as he had done before. Angelica, being Angelica, could have just taken the money from Samuel directly, but she insisted on going through the scholarship route. She wanted both the money and the recognition. When everything came to light, the professor was dismissed. The school chose not to involve the police, and considering Angelica's family situation, she wasn't expelled, only given a disciplinary action. This time, I didn't hold back. I pursued Angelica and demanded she repay all the past scholarship money. The only reason I didn't call the police was because I knew if she went to jail, her grandmother would be left with no one to care for her. Thinking back to what she said before, I couldn't help but laugh out of frustration. What she had left unsaid to Oscar must have been about this whole thing. Her roommate told me that Angelica always had a striking note stuck on her desk. Become better so he'll notice me. She cheated to get the scholarship as living expenses. Yet, in her narrative, it was all for Oscar. As she left the office, I said one last thing to her. Don't drag Oscar into your dirty business. As for Samuel, the school not only gave him a disciplinary action but also contacted his father to return the scholarship donation. They even stated that they would never accept any more donations from him in the future. Samuel's father was furious when he found out. He ordered Samuel to transfer to a foreign school and canceled the shares he had planned to give him upon graduation. The day before Samuel left, he appeared outside my dormitory. I didn't want to see him. Ever since I learned what he had done, I felt like I never really knew him at all. I glanced at him before walking past without a second thought. Vi. My revulsion peaked instantly. Didn't I tell you not to call me that? For once, he wasn't angry. He even smiled strangely. Don't be mad. It's the last time anyway. I won't bother you for the next few years. I rubbed my temples. So, what do you want? I just wanted to explain something. His tone was calm, almost gentle. I helped Angelica, but not because I like her. Not that I believed him, but it didn't matter anymore. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself. She told me that if I helped her get the scholarship, she'd find a boyfriend and personally explain to you that there was really nothing between us. What kind of reason is that? Was this somehow my fault? Samuel, do you even believe what you're saying? He looked at me, his eyes stubborn yet sincere. She promised me you'd forgive me. I couldn't tell if he was really this clueless about relationships or just making excuses. But I decided to go along with him. She lied to you. Samuel's face darkened, and he forced a smile. My phone buzzed. I picked it up and lit the screen. Oscar, about that meal I treated you to last time. Don't you think it's your turn to return the favor? I chuckled. The same excuse. And he had the nerve to use it so openly, time and time again. Do you like Oscar now? I put away my smile and pocketed my phone. Looking at Samuel, it's none of your business. I thought he was going to dredge up old arguments and question me about why I had moved on, but he just lowered his gaze quietly. After a long pause, he looked at me and smiled, a genuine smile with no pretense. I've heard from friends that he seems like a good guy. I was a little surprised. He let out a deep sigh, as if giving up on something. You should consider him. I looked at Samuel, his mouth curved, but the emotion in his eyes was all sadness. I didn't think too much about it and, for the first time in a long while, seriously responded to something he said. All right, I said. Chapter 26. It's been 2 months since Angelica's grade fraud incident. This city seems to skip autumn altogether and jump straight into winter. Not long after the incident, Angelica voluntarily dropped out. She understood that once her image collapsed, no one would hold her up anymore. Rather than being despised by others, it was better to leave first. It wasn't until dusk that I finished everything and returned to the classroom to get my books. I opened the door to find only Oscar sitting alone, playing on his phone in the empty classroom. He heard the noise and looked up. You're back. Why are you still here? I walked over slowly. He nodded toward a stack of books on the desk. I was watching over your books. Couldn't he have just texted me? Couldn't he have simply dropped them off at my dorm? But I didn't expose him, nodding as if it made sense. Right. Very reasonable. Well, to thank you, how about I treat you to? Hold up. He raised his hand and pointed at me. Don't treat me to a meal. Pick something else. I paused, looking up from my books. How about agreeing to let me pursue you? He raised an eyebrow, speaking with straightforward honesty. The setting sun spilled over the books by my hand, and in the cold winter day, I felt a rare warmth. I turned back and continued packing my books. The only sound in the air was the faint rustle of pages. That works, I casually replied. A few seconds later, I heard a soft chuckle behind me. Since that day, Oscar had seeped into my life, everywhere. Angelica's roommate, who had supported her, had wisely moved out, leaving just 3 of us in the dorm now. Both of my roommates were urging me to accept Oscar already. I was thinking the same. I put on a winter miniskirt, slipped into a long, cream-colored coat, and even applied some makeup before bouncing off to meet him outside their teaching building. The moment I stepped out the door, I couldn't help but shiver. By the time I struggled my way to the meeting spot, my legs had already gone numb. I had already cursed myself 1,000 times for being an idiot. Of all things to imitate, why copy the Korean drama heroines who don't wear pants in winter? I had just regained some feeling when the school bell rang. Among the bustling crowd, I quickly spotted Oscar. Vio. He noticed me instantly as well, but my cheerful greeting was cut short by the cold, stern look in his eyes. Who told you to dress like this? Why do you sound like my dad? Without another word, he took my hand and led me against the crowd into a classroom, locking both the front and back doors. I thought he was angry about my revealing outfit and pouted in protest. But in the next moment, Oscar had me sitting on a desk, wrapped in his black puffer jacket, carefully covering my legs. The whole time, he didn't touch my legs even once. What kind of weather is this? And you dare wear a skirt? Oscar's scolding was soft, almost murmured. After a while, I finally regained feeling in my legs and playfully tapped him with the tip of my shoe. Doesn't it look good? I batted my eyes, tilting my head to look at him. It looks good. I could clearly see a change in his expression. Do you like it? I like it. I nodded. I think you look good too. And I like you. Oscar froze for a moment, then leaned forward, his hands on the edge of the desk, staring straight into my eyes. Is it the way I think it is? My face reddened slightly, but I gathered my courage and met his gaze. Yes. Then I awkwardly raised my hands, cupped his face, and gave his cheek a light kiss. Oscar's voice was low. Is that all? Before he even finished speaking, he firmly tilted my chin upwards. Oscar leaned down. The warm sunlight reflected off the snow, stinging my half-squinted eyes. It was my first kiss.